Okay, now I'll show you how to basically animate the squash and stretch. This will be the most complicated animation exercise yet because we're going to be syncing up movement and scale. So we're going to be animating two different attributes in unison with each other and having them work together. So let's just move this ball up. So we're going to drop it in, just move it up out of frame. And I'm just going to right click here and key selected. I'll try and translate Y. So the ball starts up really high. And then I'm going to go out a few frames. So I'm going to give it 9 frames to fall all the way down and hit the ground. And then set it on the ground here. Then right click this translate Y again, key selected. Just kind of see how that goes. Okay, so it drops in. There's no stretch on this yet, so we want to stretch this ball out, giving the impression that gravity is working on it. So switch to scale tool, and it is going to be at its most stretched just before it hits the ground. So I'm going to go back 1 frame, stretch it out quite a bit, and then right click on scale Y and key selected. So if I zoom out now, the ball is still stretched, and that's what we want. We don't want the ball being unstretched. I mean, we could, like if this is where the ball was starting its fall, there would be no stretch on it. So let's key that, just see how that looks. Okay. All right, and then so you see we've got scale Y and translate Y both making curves here, so it's important to select in here and get an idea of where you're looking. So I'm on my translate Y, and right at frame 9 where it makes impact, I want my scale Y to go from stretch to squash. So that's a very sudden change over the course of a frame. All right. So splat, it hits the ground. And you can make yours as extreme as you want to make it. You know, your ball could be like my pyramid is if you want it. You don't have to be as extreme as this, but I think this helps for clarity in teaching. And please excuse some of those lighting artifacts. I'm going to go ahead and turn lighting off for this, so that's not getting in our way there. All right. And then a few frames later, I want it to settle back up. Key it. And then squash back down. Not as much as it was before. Out a little bit. And we're going to adjust all the timing. We just want to get these keys roughed in. And down. And you want it to kind of gradually settle into getting closer to resting at a scale of 1. So I'm going to zoom in here on my keys here, and you see that it's like a little sine wave, but this little baseline right here is 1, right? This little bar, if you look over here, there's my value of 1. Eventually we want our ball to just settle at 1. And I'm gonna go ahead and just set that to 1 and then key it. play blast that and see how that looks. All right, there's a couple of problems there. It just kind of snaps back up at the end, and boom, comes down, squashes real heavy. And I think this second squash is still, I think that's a little strong. So let's analyze these keyframes. So these ones at the top, these peaks are the stretch, these valleys are the squash. And if I just look at the keyframes going from squash to squash to squash to squash to squash, I can mentally draw a line between them. Right? I'm imagining there being a line. Now, so I could connect the dots kind of thing. So a line from here to here to here to here to here. And ideally, like, I think for this, these should sort of fall on a straight line. So like if these two are going to set the direction of our line, like this one here changes slope from this keyframe, from the first squash to the second squash. This one lies on a different slope. So you can pick any two of these to define a slope, and then you're going to want to move the keyframes to kind of correspond to this slope. So I'm going to move this up because I thought that this change was too, these two values are too close, right? So if I'm looking at the slope from the second squash to the third squash, that's actually significantly steeper than the slope from the first squash to the second squash. And the third squash to the fourth squash is actually, it's a little steeper than the slope from the second squash to the third squash. So I'm going to move, I'm going to press W to get the move key, draw a box around the second squash, and move that up. And then I'm going to move the third squash up as well. Once again, I'm trying to imagine it all falling along a line here. And then move this one up as well. All right, just scrubbing through, I think that already looks better. Okay, the next thing I'm looking at is, so if this line here, right here, this is 1, right? I wish these lines for things could be colored differently. So I'm looking at the difference right here where I've got, let's get in closer. All right, so here's 1, all right? I'm looking at the difference between 1 on squash and stretch, right? So down here, the squash axis is, there's a lot more squash relative to stretch. So I need to increase the amount of stretch here. So if I look over here, like, okay, so the squash keyframe is at 9, and the amount of squash is, the amount of scale Y is 0.197. We'll just say 0.2 to make it convenient and round. And this is 1.36. Okay, so we would need to move this closer to 1.8 to make it relative. I'll just enter a value there, 1.8. To make it relatively the same amount of squash to stretch. All right. So we want to do sort of the same thing on the third stretch, right? So the third squash has, say, 0.43 and then 1.24. So this should be closer to 1.6. Just doing a little bit of adding in our head. So let's go ahead and just move that to adding and subtracting in our head. That should be, all right. So there we go. So the one thing is the slope on the stretch is quite severe compared to, there we go. Yeah, so my slope was actually rather exaggerated for the first stretch. There's a little bit of a fall off, then a little bit of a fall off. And so one thing that you'll also notice is that the amount of time between the squashes and stretches starts to get a little bit longer until it doesn't over here. It kind of speeds up again. And that's something we're going to want to work on as well. So as the ball starts to lose energy, it will squash and stretch a little slower. Now there's a couple of ways we can work on that. We can select the keyframes, right? W and move them. We can also scale them. So I'm going to scale from here. Now I'm going to scale from here. So I'm increasing the length between squashes and stretches, and I'm working my way backwards from the end. Okay, so like you see this little shaded area that I've gone on out of the bounds of. So that corresponds to where my timeline range is. So this is saying like, okay, you've got some you've got some animation happening outside the boundary of your timeline. This little ticker up here, I can just grab this ticker and scale it out. And if you look down here, my timeline extends to compensate for that. All right, so that's getting too slow actually. So I'm going to rein that back in. It's very easy to overdo that. All right, I'm going to bring this into there and play blast it so we get a better idea of how this is actually looking. Just scrubbing it is not a good way to judge timing. Okay, that's not looking good at all. I should have been play blasting that more than scrubbing. All right, so the other thing is the amount of stretch here. I got ahead of myself. So this stretch slope, it changes way too fast. Bring that up. I'm imagining a line going through these. Okay, this one needs to come down a little bit. And I always want to keep in mind the amount of squash to stretch. They don't need to be, you don't have to have an exactly equal amount of squash to stretch as a ratio. You can change that up. You can have more squash or more stretch. So it's really about what you think is looking good. All right, I'm going to scale these in here. I think that will collapse some of the time between these earlier bounces quite a bit. Should make for a very energetic bounce. This may not look very good, but I want you guys to see also just how using the scale and the move tools real fast, you can make very large changes to your animation. Yep, that's too energetic. So I'm just going to undo that. So one thing that's really kind of a problem is the amount of time between this squash and this squash is far greater than the amount of time between this squash and this squash. So I'm going to actually move the keys to solve this one. And I changed key again. I went to W to move there. Now middle mouse and oops. Make sure you press shift and then middle mouse, drag it in. And you can always compare values. So from 9 to 21, that's quite a bit of time. And then from 21 to 32, the time is getting shorter. scoot it in a bit more. So you want the ball to look less energetic as time goes on, which means you want there to be more time between squashes and more time between stretches than early on. So the distance between these two stretches needs to be shorter in the beginning than the distance between these two stretches. Now, this distance here is greater than this distance here, so we need to fix that. And if you're curious about how to judge the distance, it's just you're looking at the value of when the keyframes occur. So I'm looking at this stretch keyframe. It's on frame 29, and this one's on 42. All right, so, oops. Remember, you've got a calculator. You don't have to do this in your head if you don't want to, okay? So you got 42 minus 29. That's a 13 frame distance from here to here. The distance between 20 to 29, that's 9 frames. 13 to 27 frames. Okay, so it's successively getting a little longer. 8 to 13, that's 5 frames. So it starts out real fast, and then the time between stretches starts to get slower. I'm gonna actually, this is weighted, the timing of it's a little biased towards the, I put the, what I did there is I just moved the squash keyframe to be a little more in the center between the two stretches, so it's not quite as biased towards the fourth stretch or the third stretch. All right, so just making sure that as time goes on, the amount of time between successive stretches and squashes gets longer until we settle on 1. All right, that's looking better. All right, I'm actually going to scale out the whole animation so it takes longer. So I'm going to select all the keyframes. Okay, this is a part where I could screw up. All right, so I almost scaled my my squash and stretch, the whole thing, without watching how the translate of how the ball falling in works with that, right? So the squash and stretch starts really on frame 9. So I want to scale from frame 9 onward. Press R to get the scale tool. And remember, wherever I put my mouse, that's where the pivot point is for the scaling. Hold Shift, middle mouse, and drag to the right. And that will scale everything out and maintain the proportions of the amount of distance and time, proportionally the amount of time between the keyframes. And since I scaled past what the play range was, I'm just going to drag this little marker out and give myself some more play range. And I'm going to drag out beyond where the animation is. If I just end it right here, the animation will stop where the, like the play black will stop where the animation stops, and that can be a little jarring. I like to give it a couple of frames of rest. All right. That could be tuned a little bit more, but that's just that's fine-tuning stuff, and that's just coming in here and probably, okay, so this right here is too subtle. Oops, I'm still on the scale tool. So make sure, like, if you're not on the scale tool when you want to move a keyframe, press W to move it. Shift, middle mouse, drag it up a little bit. Okay, the other thing I can do is I can edit the tangents to hold a pose longer. So I want to hold the squashes longer. So I'm going to select a squash keyframe. I'll start with the first one at 9, and I'll go to weighted tangents. I'm not going to break it. I'm going to leave them tied together still. So when I press the middle mouse key press shift, middle mouse, and then drag to the left, both sides will get weighted. So now I'm going to hold that squash a little bit longer. I'm going to do that to all of them. In fact, let's select all the tangents. Let's select all the squash keyframes. Right click, weighted tangents. Do it again. Alright, now I select one, shift key, middle mouse, drag to the left or right, and I can adjust how long it holds. So that increases the amount of time I have in that squash by a few frames, which can make a big difference. So that right there, that would just be like, it comes in, hits the squash, bounces right back out of it. This is, it comes in, it squashes, and it slows down the squash. So it kind of, you can think of this as easing into the squash, easing out of the squash, punching up into the stretch. Now I'm going to accentuate the coming into the stretch so that it comes up, it stretches. It does not hold though. It stretches, it peaks at the stretch, then it immediately starts falling out into the squash. Alright, and to do that, we need to break the tangent. So I'm going to basically make more of the stretches look like this kind of a sharp drop off here. So I'm going to select all stretches, break their tangents, and weight their tangents. And you guys should know how to do this part right here. So just remember, you gotta select the keyframe, select the handle you want to work with. Looking a little bit like a wave here. It's kind of neat. All right. Now let's play blast that. All right, so it gets a little punchy at some of those, right? You see how that changed the character of how it bounces up? It bounces up with a lot of force, so we got to watch that. So you're making these, I'm making these slopes, right? And you see how punchy that gets? I got to decide if I like that or not. Okay, so that's too much of a point. We actually do want that smoother a little, to smooth in a little bit. These kinds of little changes have a big effect in an animation. So it's still pointier than it is. You can argue whether or not that's actually better than what it was at default, but we're going to do this by hand anyway. It's good tangent editing practice. And this one here, this one was definitely a little... I'm just going to move that in. I'm not actually going to pull that up too much. Let's see here. Yeah, that's not as bad of a peak as I thought. So one thing you'll notice is that since we've been scaling, the frames are no longer all on whole numbers. These are in floating point. That's okay. Don't worry about that. All right, that's still too punchy. It's coming up too quickly to those stretches. It needs to slow down even more. May have been better off leaving it where it was, but it's worth trying. Get in closer. It's hard to select. That was weird. All right, that last squash and stretch is a little strange. Maybe it's doing too much. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm not liking that last one. I'm just going to flatten it out. Select scale Y. What's this at? That's scale, yeah, that's 9.25. That's already pretty much 1. So I'm just going to grab these keyframes, delete them, and set this one to 1. Just in the channel editor. You can set keyframe values on a key that's already been set. You can set them in the channel editor right here. You can set them in this right here. So just make sure you're actually on it. 1. Why are you going to 1.01? Oh, I see. And I'm going to set that to 63 as well instead of a. There we go. That's better. It was just going on too long. I can ease that in a little bit more so it slows in a little more gradually. Yeah, so since this is coming in from, it's coming in from a stretch into what would have been a squash, but we're resting back at 1. And since my squashes, I've really pulled them out and exaggerated how they squash in like that. I want that to be gradual, like so. This one might be exaggerated a little bit too much. Those are unified, so it'll work on both sides. It's unified. There we go. All right. All right, it still goes on a little bit too long, I might think, but you get the idea. So spend some time timing these and comparing them, and remember you've got all sorts of tools at your disposal here, so you can move keys, you can scale keys, you know, that's moving them, that's scaling them. So I mostly scaled lengthwise, but you can also scale the amplitude of this, right? So you can change how much they all scale, how much squash and stretch there is. I'd probably do it from the baseline of this keyframe right here because it's based on 1, right? So scale it up and down. You can increase these things, right? So you can make a lot of really big changes without having to select everything by hand and change them all that way. And then of course you've got finer control right down to the tangents. Don't forget to change between move and scale tool. So you've got a lot of freedom in how you edit and work with these keyframes. Don't forget you got to do all 3 of these, and you want to try and convey a different sense of mass and matter as far as what they're actually made up of for all 3 of these little primitives.